Over 20 years ago, Final Fantasy VII touched the hearts and minds of gamers, and to this day, it remains one of the most beloved games of all time for a large part of the gaming community. As we look towards the remake of such a cherished game, it's become apparent that elements of that game will be changed, scrapped, or rebuilt for modern gaming audiences. One of the pieces of the remake which is confirmed to be changing is the combat system, which is changing from an active time battle system to an action combat system. This is Radical Edward for Less Than Epic, and this is the pros and cons of action combat for the Final Fantasy VII Remake. For those who don't know, let's cover real quick what active time battle and action combat actually are so we can have a reference point for our pros and cons. The active time battle system is similar in many ways to a more traditional turn-based combat system in which players have unlimited time to make combat decisions. Instead, players have a charge time, noted by the ATG gauge, which tracks when party members are going to act. When the gauge is full, players can perform actions with the character. In later Final Fantasies, such as Final Fantasy VII, some actions were given additional wait time, such as when casting spells or using special abilities. In contrast to most wait-based decision systems, such as active time combat, action combat focuses on allowing maximum input and movement potential of the player. All positioning and actions can be chosen at will by the player. Most action combat implementations are amalgamation systems which combine weight-based elements into otherwise free-moving combat systems, a great example of which is Diablo's combat system. Final Fantasy XV also implements a near-pure action combat system, which their creators called the Active X Battle AXB system, pronounced Active Cross Battle. What we can immediately gather from the descriptions of these combat systems is that each system provides a very different type of strategy which can be utilized for success, and it's on that note that we can finally start to define some pros and cons of each of the systems as it relates to the Final Fantasy VII Remake. So what are some of the pros? Number 1, more engaging combat. Let's get this one out of the way as I think it's a more minor point for longtime players of Final Fantasy. Yes, action combat from a strict input and positioning standpoint will be necessarily more engaging as more button presses will be required to win battles. Of course, there are strategic downsides to this, which we will cover in the cons section later, but the proposal of having a more Dark Souls-like combat system in my Final Fantasy is a fairly appealing statement to someone who loves both franchises. This guy. Number 2, spatial-based strategy. If action combat in games has taught us anything, it's that different strategies work well against different opponents. For instance, if we take Cloud and Barret from Final Fantasy VII, we can see two very different combat strategies being implemented. In an action combat system, Cloud would focus on heavy, close-range combat with his Buster Sword to outmaneuver and overwhelm opponents. This would be very effective against larger, ground-based opponents like the Guard Scorpion, and weaker against air opponents or groups of more spread-out opponents. In contrast, Barret would focus on light, long-range combat with his Gatling gun, keeping his distance to whittle down opponents. This would be very effective against air-based opponents or groups of more spread-out opponents, and weaker against larger, ground-based opponents like the Guard Scorpion. Basically, in an action combat system, we would expect Cloud and Barret's combat to complement each other even more than they do in the active time battle system. Number 3, stealth-based mechanics. It has been confirmed that there will be no random encounters in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, meaning that enemies will just be out in the open environment with the player. The player will be able to choose whether to enter combat or to use stealth mechanics to avoid combat. This adds an entire layer of complexity to not just combat, but the environment exploration and immersion as well. So those are my top 3 high-level pros of the Final Fantasy VII Remake using action combat instead of active time battle. Now let's take a look at my top 3 high-level cons of moving away from ATB. So what are the cons? Number 1, Materia System gutted. If you haven't watched my Materia System analysis video for the Final Fantasy VII Remake yet, I suggest you do, as I cover this topic fairly extensively there. Links will be in the description. Basically, what action combat does to materia is makes much of it unusable or dumbed down. That issue is compounded by the fact that all magic materia is being split from the materia system in the remake. All of the materia I am showing on screen will have to be cut from the remake, as they will not work given the new materia system rules, and anyone who has played the original Final Fantasy VII will know how that has many implications of character builds, which leads me to my second con. Number 2, simplified character builds. Action combat doesn't necessarily mean that character builds will be simplified, but removal of materia as a result of action combat basically ensures it, unless Square Enix develops an entirely new character build system for the remake. No longer will you be able to min-max your character stats based on the materia you have equipped, and while we don't exactly know or have insight as to what Square Enix will be doing, we're fairly confident, or rather scared, that whatever they do, it will be much simpler than the original Final Fantasy VII. Number 3, and this is probably the biggest one for me, far fewer combat strategies. To a great extent, this also extends from the gutting of the materia system. I can't understate how much this one fact is going to change how players interact with the game. Anyway, combos like all plus restore or all plus fire materia combinations are gone if the materia and magic are split. Slash all is gone if 3D space is a factor in the combat system, and mime is basically gone as well for the same reason. You can basically kiss enemies' skill goodbye, unless they of course decide to go back on splitting magic from materia entirely. Double cut and death blow can likely remain, but how about long range materia? In action combat, this type of combo between short-range characters like Tifa and long-range mechanics become impossible, or at the very least radically changed, if there's that 3D space mechanic. Anyway, I could continue to pick apart how many materia would just simply not work in an action combat system, but I think you get the point. The amount of combat options when moving to an action combat system are simply less and greatly simplified. Given the amount of strategies players have imagined over the past 20 plus years of playing Final Fantasy VII, it's clear that many of these strategies will have to be thrown out when moving to an action combat system in the remake. Don't get me wrong, I am not an ATB purist, as I very much enjoy action combat, but Final Fantasy VII isn't just an IP. It's a universe with beloved characters and mechanics, and I understand full well why many players are frustrated at the loss of active time battle. To those players, know that I am there with you, but I am also optimistic. I believe Square Enix understands the repercussions of changing mechanics of a beloved franchise, and I am certain that they will not forget about us core fans in their production of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Hopefully my list of pros and cons left you at least a little excited about the possibilities for combat in the remake. And I'll be continuing to cover the Final Fantasy VII Remake right here on Less Than Epic. So thanks for watching everyone, and thank you for your continued support of our channel. If you liked the video, then like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that little bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. This has been Radical Edward for Less Than Epic, signing out.